Hello, welcome to another GCSE history lesson with me, Mr. Durbin. We are on our settlers topic in the Viking expansion unit. We've looked at how the Vikings settled in different parts of Western Europe, and we're going to zoom in on one place today, Jorvik in the north of England. Before we do that, though, let's get ready for the quiz. Make sure you've got your title, sorry, your date down and underlined, and we'll get ready for the 5 questions in the quiz. You can use your knowledge organizer to help you. Let's see if we can recall it from our memory before we look anything up. Here are your 5 questions. You can pause the video now and come back when you're ready for the answers. Okay, welcome back. I'm going to put the answers in now. Pause, give you a bit more time. Okay, here are your answers. Let's just pay special attention to number 5. So why did the government have to pay attention to the health of ordinary people by the end of the 19th century? If you remember, this is because at the beginning of the 19th century, only a very small percentage of the population, maybe about 3%, could vote. By the end of the 19th century, almost all working men, but no working women, could vote. And that meant that unless the government actually did something about the health of ordinary people were going to vote them out of government. Okay, let's go back to the Vikings then. Pause if you need more time to correct your answers here. Use your purple pen to do that. I'm going to introduce today's lesson now. So just pop everything down and just watch the video. We're on our settlers unit, and you can use the settlers page, I think it's page 4 in your knowledge organizer to help you. And we're on box 11 today. So if you want to have some notes out in front of you, box 11 in the knowledge organizer will help you. Last time we looked at settlement in Western Europe. We looked at raiding in Western Europe, how the Vikings attacked the monasteries and then sailed inland to start attacking and overwintering in different parts of Europe. Last few lessons we've looked at settlements. We've seen how the Vikings settled in the Scottish Islands, in Ireland itself, in France, and in England in the Danelaw. Today we're going to focus in just on England. And let me just recap where we are with that. So we remember the adventures of the rampaging of the great heathen army that rampaged around England for 14 years before the treaty between Alfred and Guthrum meant that the Vikings had to stay in the Danelaw, which is in pink on this map, in the north and east of England. The Danelaw was ruled by jarls and later kings, as we're going to find out today, who lived in these fortified burhs, which are like strongly defended towns. And they were often just places that the Anglo-Saxons had lived before, and the Vikings took them over. The most powerful of these burhs was Jorvik, which is on the site of the modern-day city of York in the north of England. This is where the Danelaw was ruled from. Today we're going to look at what life was like in Jorvik for Vikings who lived there. And almost everything we know, or most of the things we know about life in Jorvik, comes from archaeological evidence, from archaeologists who have dug underneath the ground to find artifacts, remains left behind by the Vikings. The most important of these finds actually didn't happen in Jorvik, but it happened on this river called the River Ribble, which runs through Lancashire and meets the sea near Preston. This is what the River Ribble looks like today. But in 1840, so actually about the time that working men were getting the vote in our People's Health course, but 1,000 years after the Vikings were there, some workmen were doing some repairs to the banks of the river, and they found a Viking treasure hoard. This Viking treasure hoard is known as the Cuerdale Hoard, after the village Cuerdale, which was near the River Ribble where it was found. And this is the largest treasure hoard, a hoard means like a load of treasure, found belonging to the Vikings anywhere in Britain. And I think it's maybe the third largest or even the second largest found anywhere in the world. This is just a selection of some of the jewelry, coins, and metal goods that were found in this treasure hoard. You can see here, these are like bracelets and bangles. And we can see here the remains of tools and other jewelry. This was obviously a collection of a huge amount of treasure. And the most exciting part of this is that All of this treasure did not come from the same place. Most of the treasure and the coins came from the Danelaw. Some of the treasure came from Anglo-Saxon England, places like Wessex, which must have been trading with the Vikings. And some of the treasure came from thousands of miles away, places like Scandinavia, Russia, Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire, Iceland, Greenland. So we know that actually this hoard was on a trading route that must have connected huge areas of the Viking world. So using some of this treasure and knowing where it came from, we can start to piece together a map, and it shows us why Jorvik was so important. You can see Jorvik here in the north of England. It's in the Danelaw. And Jorvik was so important because it was on this trade route that linked together two rivers. One was the River Ouse, one of the great rivers of the north of England that flowed through Jorvik. And then, not a huge distance from the source of the Ouse, you could reach the source of the Ribble, this other river. And we know from what the Vikings did in Eastern Europe that they were very skilled at using rivers to transport their goods, but then taking their boats out of the rivers and dragging them overland to reach another river. On the other side of the Irish Sea, from Ribble, the River Ribble, where it met the sea, was the important Viking settlement of Dublin, which we learned about in our last couple of lessons. This is the most important settlement in Viking Ireland. This meant that the Vikings could come from Scandinavia, sail up the River Ouse, take their boats overland to the River Ribble, and sail across the Irish Sea to Dublin. If we think about this trading route as a trading route that links up Ireland with Scandinavia, and then from Scandinavia we can reach all the way down through Russia towards places like the Byzantine Empire, and then from Ireland, as we're going to see in our next lesson, we can reach up to places like Iceland and Greenland. What we find out here is that Jorvik is actually like the pivot point at the center of this trading route. Because it's on the River Ouse and it's near the River Ribble, it links up Dublin and Scandinavia. And in a way, Jorvik was at the center of the Viking world. We're going to do a bit of practice on this in a second, but for the moment, can you pause your video and can you write down this title? What does the archaeological evidence tell us about Viking Jorvik? Pause the video now, come back when you've got it written down. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. Archaeological evidence, obviously, is evidence like the Cuerdale hoard, evidence that was found underground, left behind by the Vikings. So before we start, let's do some practice on that. There's two parts to this task. The first task, you know how to do this by now. You have to write a question that's going to give me this answer. So think carefully about what we've learned so far in today's lesson, what question could give you those answers. And then for task 2, I want you to write me a paragraph, several sentences, using the sentence starter, Jorvik was important to the Vikings because, and then I want to see if you can include those 6 words in your answer. This is going to take you 5 or 6 minutes. Pause the video now and come back to see some answers when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. Here are the answers that I wrote. You can pause the video now and reflect on what you wrote and use your purple pen to change things if you need to. Okay, I'm going to move on for this slide, so pause if you need more time to do corrections with your purple pen. We're going to go now to another archaeological dig. This archaeological dig happened relatively recently in the 1970s. It's one of the biggest archaeological digs in British history, and it happened right in the centre of the city of York. So you can see behind there's a museum and a shopping centre. And down at the bottom of this picture, you can see all the archaeologists who are working on this archaeological dig. And around the outside, you can see people who are coming to look. It was in a part of York called the Coppergate. And that's why it's called the Coppergate Dig. The Coppergate Dig unveiled another huge selection of Viking artifacts, but also, crucially, it gave evidence of how the Vikings lived in York. As you can see from this aerial photo, you can start to see that the archaeologists are excavating, they're digging up the remains of houses where the Vikings lived, streets, and much more than just like bits of treasure. And by collating and collecting all this evidence, we can start to piece together what Viking life in Jorvik was like. And where we've got gaps, there are some written sources that we can use to combine with what we found underground to try and make sense of it. So we've got these two archaeological digs. We've got the hoard of treasure, the Cuerdale hoard, and then we've got this dig, the Coppergate dig. And they're where we're getting most of our evidence from. This is a modern artist representation of what we think Viking Jorvik might have looked like. You can see it's quite a bleak and crowded place. You've got wooden houses with thatched roofs. In the distance on the left-hand side, you can see the masts of ships on the River Ouse that are going to be taking goods to and from Scandinavia and Dublin. And you can see that most people have a long sort of stretch of garden that they're using for chickens and to grow food. We need to know three things about Viking Jorvik. We're going to learn about the homes that Vikings lived in Jorvik. We're going to learn about the trade, some of the trade goods that came through Viking Jorvik. And finally, we're going to think about this word assimilation, becoming similar to, because obviously there were people who lived in Jorvik, York, before the Vikings arrived, the Anglo-Saxons, the English people. And we want to know a little bit about how far the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons assimilated to each other, became similar to each other. Let's start off with homes. I'd like you to write a little subheading, homes, in your book. Then you can put your pens down. I'm going to talk you through what we know about the Viking homes in Jorvik, and then you're going to do some practice. But whilst I talk, you don't need your pen in your hand at all. So here's maybe a little bit more detail of a modern artist representation of what we think Jorvik looked like. You can see that the houses are quite cramped. They're packed together quite closely. And actually, this town looks quite overcrowded. There's lots of people in quite a small space. And you can see that the streets aren't very wide and that there's a lot going on. There's lots of animals roaming around on the streets. And if you think about the context of this in our people's health unit, you could think about like some of the hygiene problems that might exist in this town. People being very close together all the time, which means it's very easy to spread disease between them. But also that so many animals around that there's likely to be lots of fleas and rats in the streets that might present health problems to the population. What about the houses themselves then? Sorry, this is just another representation of the street, a bit more zoomed in. You can see it's very busy, lots of things you can buy, lots of things you can do, lots of things going on, lots of animals, quite a bustling place. The houses themselves. This is a pencil drawing of what we think the houses look like, and this is based on the archaeological finds from Jorvik. Firstly, we can see that the houses are quite small, so they were about 7 meters long and about 4 meters wide, and sort of an adult male is about 2 meters tall, or just under 2 meters tall. So that gives you a sense of the size. Quite small houses, and often quite large families would live in these houses. You can see that there's kind of a kitchen area, and in the middle here, let me get my pointer out so you can see. In the middle, you can see the hearth where there would have been a fire and a with a pot for cooking, maybe pottage in this pot. And there were no windows because there was no glass. Glass was very, very expensive, and the sort of technology to make windows had not yet been developed. So that meant that it would be very smoky and dark and gloomy inside, because if you cut a hole in the wall, you just get very cold. What about the materials that the house is made from? Well, the main structure of the house, as you can see here, is made of wood. That's why so few of these have survived, because the wood rots away. What we've got evidence of in Coppergate is where the wood has been preserved under layers of soil. Then the roof is made of thatch. Thatch is straw, like you might give to an animal, like packed together, which makes it waterproof and also keeps the heat in the house. But it also means that that smoke can't escape, so it's a very smoky place. And then, as you can kind of see here, on the back of the wooden planks, the Vikings used wattle and daub, which is a mixture of mud and sticks, and they packed it onto the walls, which would have stopped any drafts coming through, which would have kept them warm in the winter months. These houses were pretty well constructed, but there still would have been drafty, it still would have been cold, and it still would have been quite packed in with other members of your family. And definitely, if you think about hygiene and so on, it would have been impossible to avoid, for example, catching a contagious disease from somebody else who lived in this house who had a contagious disease. There was no social distancing in here. The other health risk, of course, was that, as you will notice, there's no toilet in this house. This Viking here has been, he's a recreation of a Viking. It's not a photo of him. He's going to the toilet in his outdoor latrine. A latrine, as you know, is a medieval toilet. And so outside the house, in the garden, there would have been a latrine which would have filled up a cesspit. And as we know, this is going to create all sorts of health problems because the latrine could contaminate and the cesspit could contaminate drinking supplies, leading to all sorts of health issues. Okay, now time for you guys to do your practice. So you can grab your pens. Exactly the same as before. There's 3 questions to write that are going to give me these 3 answers. And then there's a paragraph to write about why life in Jorvik was potentially quite unhealthy. And I want that paragraph to be more than just a sentence, right? You need to give me some developed explanation of the different health risks that life in Jorvik posed. I want you to pause the video now and come back when you're done. Okay, welcome back. If you need more time, pause the video again. Here's the questions that I wrote. You might have slightly different ones. And then here's my paragraph, not a huge long paragraph, right? But I've talked about the outdoor latrines in the cesspit. You also might have talked about the cramped and overcrowded conditions. That's absolutely fine. You can pause the video now to just check you've got things in the right place here. And then unpause when you want to move on. Okay, let's move on. We've looked at homes. We're now going to look at trade. As we suggested at the start, Jorvik was incredibly important because of its place on Viking trade routes. Here's our map. So remember that the Vikings, Jorvik was important because it was near 2 rivers. It was on the River Ouse, a great river in the north of England, and it was near the River Ribble, a slightly smaller river. And that meant the Vikings could come from Scandinavia, travel up the River Ouse, maybe with their trading goods, stop off at Jorvik, sell their goods potentially, and they could also reach in the other direction Dublin by travelling along the River Ribble. So this meant that goods could come from this direction, Ireland, and get sold and exchanged in Jorvik. It also meant that goods could come from this direction, from Scandinavia and beyond, and get sold and exchanged in Jorvik. So if you were someone who lived in Ireland, you could go to Jorvik to buy things that weren't available in Ireland, perhaps, but had to be imported, brought in from Scandinavia. We're going to talk about 2 items that were found in the Coppergate dig that give us a clue as to some of the connections that Jorvik had to other parts of the Viking world. The first of these is a silk cap. On the right-hand side, you can see this is the actual silk cap that was found. It's over 1,000 years old. It's been buried underground for most of that, so it's lost its colour and it's also lost its hair ties, but the silk has been preserved. And you can see on the left-hand side here, this is what it would have looked like. So it would have been worn by a woman, we think, and it would have been sort of a hair covering. Silk was incredibly expensive. So it was not ordinary Viking women who would have been wearing the silk cap. It was probably going to be incredibly high status Viking women, and maybe Viking women who were related to the Viking king who lived in Jorvik. We're going to talk about that in a second. Why was silk so expensive? Well, silk was so expensive because basically there was only one place in the known world that the Vikings could get silk from, and that was nowhere near Jorvik. Silk came from the Byzantine Empire. So down here, as we talked about this in the Volga Vikings unit, so the Volga Vikings lived around here in sort of modern day Russia, and they made contact with the Byzantine Empire, and they did trading with them. One of the things you could get from the Byzantine Empire was silk. That's because that silk, even before it was in the Byzantine Empire, it was brought in from China, so it still had already come a long way. And the Volga Vikings, when they bought this silk in the Byzantine Empire, in the bazaars of Constantinople, then they would take it to Scandinavia, and from Scandinavia, it maybe then got sold on to Jorvik. So here's our silk. It starts here in the Byzantine Empire. It's bought by some Viking traders. It's brought across the Black Sea in Viking boats and up the Dnieper River to Scandinavia and then to Jorvik. So this has come a very long way. So if we look at our trade routes within England, the silk cap is coming in from Scandinavia into Jorvik. So we know that the Vikings had amazing connections from Jorvik to Scandinavia, their homeland, but even beyond, you couldn't get silk from Scandinavia. You had to go and trade with the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople to get that silk. What about the other direction? Another important find in the Coppergate dig was this comb and this dice for playing games. Now, both the dice and the comb are made of the same material. They're slightly different color because they're slightly different ages. Both the comb and the dice are made from walrus ivory. Now, ivory is when we normally talk about ivory, we talk about the tusks of the elephants. So, for example, ivory is often used to make jewelry, but we also use it, for example, to make piano keys. That white material on the top of piano keys is made of ivory, and it comes from the tusks of elephants. But walrus ivory doesn't come from elephants, it comes from walruses. Walruses are these massive animals, huge, fat, kind of like seals, but they're different from seals. They're much bigger. In fact, they eat seals. And they've got, as you can see here, these two huge tusks. Now, walruses are not generally found around the coast of Britain, although you may have seen in the news that one got lost and was seen on the coast of Ireland recently and then in Wales. They live in the Arctic. So they live in the cold water around the Arctic Circle. You might be able to see some in the north of Sweden, but generally they are found in large numbers around Iceland and around Greenland. As we're going to find out later in this unit, the Vikings settled in those places. And they hunted walruses, which must have been quite a tricky business because not only are walruses massive, they're also quite violent and they've got those amazing tusks and they can also swim in the sea. So hunting them must have been a tricky business. But when the Vikings did hunt them, they cut off their tusks and they carved the ivory that was contained in their tusks into things like this comb and this dice. So we think the walrus ivory came from around the coast of Iceland, which is this northern island up here. And it would have been traded, probably taken in boats from Iceland to Ireland, and then from Ireland traded from Dublin to Jorvik. So it came through this route, down through Ireland, into Dublin, through the River Ribble, and to Jorvik. So we've got the silk that's coming from the Byzantine Empire to Scandinavia, down the River Ouse, and then to the markets of Jorvik, and then the walrus ivory that's coming in the different direction. There was loads and loads of products like metals and other fabrics, leather. There was also available for purchase in Jorvik. But just for the sake of today's lesson, let's just learn these two materials, silk and walrus ivory. Okay, can you put a subheading in your book then? Trade. And then let's do some practice on this. So just as before, there are 3 answers. You have to write me 3 questions. And then for task 2, Jorvik was well connected to other parts of the world. For example, can you explain for me, it needs to be at least 3 sentences, this paragraph, 2 ways in which Jorvik was connected to other parts of the world? Can you pause the video now? Come back when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. Here are your answers. So you can check your questions. You might have different questions to me, that's fine, but if you're stuck, you can look at the questions here. And there's my paragraph at the bottom. So I've explained on one hand how silk came from the Byzantine Empire, and then also how Jorvik was connected to Iceland by the import of walrus ivory. If you're not sure about this Iceland place, don't worry. Next lesson, lots about Iceland. Okay, so we've looked at trade, we looked at homes. Pause if you need more time on this slide, but we're going to move on to look at the final part of our Jorvik study, and that is assimilation. I'd like you to write down this word assimilation as a subheading, and then I want you to write down the definition here. Assimilation is when two groups mix and become similar. We've seen this process happen in all sorts of different places. First, with the Viking relationships with the Slavs in Russia, and then also with the Viking relationships with the French in Normandy, becoming the Normans, and the Irish in Ireland. How do you use this word in a sentence? So we might say here, the Vikings assimilated with the Anglo-Saxons. What does that mean? It basically means this: the Vikings became similar to the Anglo-Saxons. It also might mean that the Anglo-Saxons became a bit similar to the Vikings, right? It's a two-way process. So make sure we're confident on this word, because we've seen it before. We're going to use it again. Pause, you need more time to finish that definition. Let's talk about assimilation. So we know that in Jorvik, Vikings and Anglo-Saxons assimilated together. They became similar to each other. Viking ideas influenced the Anglo-Saxons. For example, we know about Viking words entering the English language. And also Anglo-Saxon ideas influenced the Vikings. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Why was this the case? Well, firstly, Vikings and Anglo-Saxons were living side by side in Jorvik. We saw in the Scottish Islands how the Vikings came and basically wiped out the Picts who lived there. That didn't happen in the Danelaw. It didn't happen in Jorvik. The Vikings settled down and lived alongside the Anglo-Saxons, trading with them and communicating with them and living side by side. And this meant that inevitably, over a period of years, you started to get Anglo-Saxons and Vikings getting married to each other. So they had children who were Viking Anglo-Saxons. And after a while, it was difficult to tell who was a Viking and who was an Anglo-Saxon because people were their sort of family lines were getting muddled up, and the distinction between two groups kind of lessened. So we do know there's some assimilation going on. Where things get a little bit more tricky is what the Vikings thought about themselves in Jorvik. And one of the issues here is about religion. The Vikings had the Jarl who was in charge of Jorvik became essentially the Viking king of England. And there were 12 or 13 different Viking kings of the Danelaw who lived in Jorvik and ruled the Danelaw from Jorvik. We don't need to know too much about them, but one of the things we do need to know about them is that they minted coins. What this means is that they produced coins. If you mint a coin as a king, right, you make a coin and you put your name on it. So you know, for example, like in our modern society, we have our coins. They have been minted at this place called The Mint in London. And they've got the Queen's face on them, got her name on it. And it's a way of basically the king or the queen showing off their power by saying like, well, I control the money in this country. So to mint coins is to produce them. Minting means producing coins. It's got nothing to do with like Trebor extra strong. But it has got something to do with the word minted, like that slang word. If you say, oh, that guy's minted, he's really rich, yeah, he can produce coins. Lots of these coins were found in the Cuerdale hoard, that find of Viking treasure on the banks of the River Ribble. There's a coin here on the right-hand side. Now, one of the ways this suggests assimilation is that the Vikings didn't know how to produce coins before they came to England. They learned how to produce coins from the Anglo-Saxons. So one of the ways the Vikings assimilated was that they lived where the Anglo-Saxons lived, in Jorvik, and they copied some of their techniques, for example, producing coins. But then actually these coins themselves tell us something about assimilation. Let's look at one side of this coin. Around the outside, that text, that's the name of the Viking king. But in the middle, there's something really interesting. There's a Christian cross. This cross suggests to us that the Viking king, who put his name around the outside, was a Christian. Right? Why would you put a Christian cross in the middle of your coin unless you were a Christian? And that would fit, right? Because we know, for example, that the Vikings converted to Christianity in Ireland. We know that when King Alfred got Guthrum to sign the Treaty of Wedmore, he had to agree to convert to be a Christian. And so it would make sense that the Vikings converted to Christianity. However, we have got to question how committed the Vikings were to this Christianity. Because obviously we know that the Vikings had other religions, their own Norse religion with their gods like Thor and Odin, and ideas about Valhalla and Asgard and Midgard, for example. And we don't have to look very far to see that the Vikings were not committed. All we have to do is turn the coin over to the other side. Because on the other side of this coin, there is a bird in the middle. And this bird has got an important place in Norse religion because this bird is a raven. And you guys know that the ravens were the helpers of Odin. They were his symbol. So this is very confusing for us. On one side of this coin is a Christian cross. The Vikings became Christians. They converted to Christianity. On the other side of the same coin is the raven, the symbol of Odin. So it's like they're just hedging their bets, maybe. They're saying, like, well, oh, yeah, one side of this coin, we're Christians. Yeah, maybe if Christianity is true and there's just one God and we need to do this and that to get to heaven, he'll be happy with our coin. But for the other side, oh, we're still loyal to Odin. We still think Odin is the chief god. We'll put his raven on just to cover our backs with him. Maybe. Either way, it suggests that yes, the Vikings were aware of Christianity and they embraced it, but how deeply committed to it were they? We don't know. What about we add in another argument here? How about this? Here's a Viking skeleton buried in a coffin, a wooden coffin you can see here, as part of the Coppergate dig. Now you might think, what does a dead Viking tell us? What can we learn from them about their religion? And actually, from their skeleton, not that much, but we can learn something about the place they were buried, because they were buried in a churchyard alongside other Anglo-Saxons who were Christians. Now, it seems unlikely that you would bother going to the hassle of burying someone in a churchyard unless you knew they were a Christian and that the church meant something to them. So the fact that lots of Vikings were buried in churchyards, that kind of adds weight to the argument that the Vikings did become Christians like the Anglo-Saxons, and they did assimilate with them, even if they kept those Norse gods, Odin and Thor and the ravens. If they still, had some respect for those gods, they were at least, in terms of where they were buried and the symbols they were using, becoming more Christian. Quite a lot of complicated information there. So let's do a bit of practice. Task 1, what's the question? There's 5 answers. You've got to write me 5 questions. And then I really want you to get stuck into task 2 here. I want you to write me a paragraph using the sentence starters. So you're going to say, historians disagree over how committed the Vikings were to Christianity. On the one hand, I'd like you to give me some information that the Vikings became Christians. You could talk about the graveyard. You could talk about the cross on the coin. On the other hand, give me the counter argument. What's the evidence from the coin that the Vikings were not committed Christians? Think about the raven. Pause the video now. This is maybe going to take you a little bit longer, so you've got 7 or 8 minutes to do this. Come back when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. I'm going to show you the answers that I got. Check through the questions. You might have different questions, that's fine. And then you might want to have a look at the paragraph there at the bottom. So the 2 pieces of evidence that the Vikings were committed Christians, they were buried in churchyards, and they minted those coins that featured a Christian cross. But then, on the other hand, their coins still featured images of the Norse gods, like Odin's ravens, the same coins. Okay, so pause, check through this. If you need more time, use your purple pen and so on. Right, there's one last thing to do, depending on how much time you got left in today's lesson, and that's this. I want you to turn to a new page. And I want you to lay out a spider diagram that looks like this. Jorvik in the middle, trade, homes, assimilation. What I'd like you to do is spend 5 minutes writing down as much information as you can remember about those 3 headings or under those 3 headings from today's lesson. After 5 minutes, stop, look back at your notes and add some more bits. That's the end of today's lesson. I will see you guys next time for the next Vikings lesson, where we'll look at the Vikings going further than England. We're going to look at Iceland, Greenland, and Vikings in America.